And yes, I have to admit to being guilty of that, of getting the call of someone requesting me to come to Hobart and saying yes without really being too concerned about what it was that I needed to talk about. Usually when I come to Tasmania, I'm on a large bike tour with some friends, and we're always fascinated by how few people there are in the state when we're riding around, and now I know where they all are. So thanks very much for taking time out of your Saturday to come and hear about some of the things that people are doing on peak oil. And I'm going to be talking about the contingency plan that we wrote for Maribyrnong City Council to help them adapt the way that they do business so that they can still function effectively in a situation of less oil than they have now. Now, usually I start these talks by talking a little bit about peak oil, but I'm not going to do that today because I'm assuming that people have the peak oil basics down pretty well. But having said that, I am going to mention just a few numbers, and I think one of the reasons why I like learning about peak oil is that I like numbers, and there are lots of numbers in peak oil. So the first number is 1964, and that's the year in which the most oil was discovered, and since that time we've been finding less and less oil each year. And the second number is 1983, or 1982 rather, and that's the year that we've been using more oil than we've been finding, and that's now got to the point where we use 4 barrels of oil for every one that we discover. And so it's, and Corey's heard all this before from yesterday, so apologies Corey, but it's a little bit like going to your financial planner and telling them that you've been spending 4 times more the amount of money that you've been earning, and that's been going on for a couple of decades. Now, obviously that's not something that can continue, and yet the plan that particularly state and federal government have is that yes, it can continue, and in fact we can consume even more oil than we've been consuming in the last few years. And so I think that's a real problem. At the moment in Australia, we produce about 50% of our oil needs here in Australia, and the rest is brought in from overseas. And the projection from Geoscience Australia is that by 2020, only 27% of the oil that we consume will come from domestic sources, and the rest will be coming from overseas. And so that's a real problem because so many other countries are also expecting to have a similar situation in terms of their oil supply from domestic sources versus oil being imported from other countries. And so those two things don't really work out too well. And the other thing I wanted to mention before I get stuck into the slides is what happened a couple of weeks ago with the volcanic ash. And I'm a bit of a news junkie, and I heard the Premier and also the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Tasmania talking about the devastating effect that the ash plume is having on Tasmania's economy. And that was just from not having flights going for 2 or 3 days. And I think to me that illustrated the reliance that the Tasmanian economy has to aviation transport and what would happen in a longer term sense if aviation wasn't as feasible as it is now. So in terms of the outline for the talk, I'm going to be talking about contingency planning generally, and then the process that we used with Maribyrnong City Council, which is in the inner west of Melbourne. So it's about 5 kilometres from the CBD. And I'm going to, part of that process was identifying key service areas. And so this can be done for a local council or it can be done for an organisation. It doesn't really matter, but it's trying to identify the areas of council that use a lot of oil or that have services that are particularly critical for the health of the community or the functioning of the council. And developing risk profiles to better understand the areas that are going to be impacted on the most heavily so that you can focus resources on those areas, because peak oil infiltrates so many different areas of council. To provide something that is achievable and something that people can understand, it's important to at least initially try and narrow the focus on the areas that are the most critical. And I'm going to be talking briefly about some trigger points, and what trigger points are basically points that the council can look at once the contingency plan has been developed, that council can keep monitoring so that they know when they're going to need to start enacting some of the contingencies that have been built in as part of the plan. And then finally, highlighting some of the emerging themes. So these are areas that don't just sit within one particular area of council, but they seem to span right across the whole organisation. So the main aim of this process, or the main aim of the contingency plan, was to maximise council's business continuity ability. And I think that's really important to note. It's about trying to maintain business continuity in the face of this threat to either a short or a long-term supply reduction. So we used some scenario planning exercises so that the officers within council could have something very practical and realistic that they could focus on in order to exercise their minds to come up with some practical solutions. So these are some of the different jurisdictions that have come out with peak oil contingency plans or peak oil policies over recent years. Most of them there are from Australia that are on this slide, but there are plenty of United States councils that have also developed plans, as well as some in the UK. I could easily run 2 or 3 slides just with the front covers of different reports these days, whereas in 2005 I couldn't do that. So this is an area that more and more councils are getting involved with. One of the key motivations that council had when they decided to commission this report was that they shouldn't cling to crude right down to the last drop, and they should leave oil before it left them. Which is something that the International Energy Agency has been saying as well. And I think it's important to highlight that this isn't just a far left-wing council that's going out on its own here. This is something now that is very consistent with what some of the international agencies have been charged with doing in terms of reducing our vulnerability to higher fuel prices in the future. So in I guess very brief form, what we did with the council was firstly conducted some background research about the unique demographics of the particular municipality in terms of vulnerable communities, in terms of transport patterns, in terms of income, in terms of the economy, the level of local food production, and also the capacity of the local community to produce food in the future, those sorts of areas. And then we established a steering committee, which was formed from key managers in areas that are most likely to be impacted upon in the event of an oil supply disruption. And so those council managers were there so that we as consultants could get rapid access to the information that we needed in order to develop the report. And whilst I was initially concerned about the possibility of having to work with a steering committee in terms of having to draw out the process to an even larger degree than it already was, in actual fact it made the process much more efficient by getting access to everyone that we needed to speak to in a timely fashion. And through the work with that steering committee, we're able to develop a very clear picture of where the 10 service areas are within council's business model that we needed to focus on in order to maximise council's resilience to higher fuel prices. And then we worked with those 10 areas in a workshop setting for half a day with the council staff themselves, explaining a little bit about peak oil, but more importantly, finding out from them, after explaining a short-term supply disruption and a long-term reduction in oil use, in oil supply, how they would do the things that they're used to doing, whether it's road maintenance or waste collection or Meals on Wheels, whatever it happened to be. And then developing risk profiles, and then putting forward some recommendations. And to a large degree, the recommendations really came from the council staff themselves, and we were very conscious as consultants not to come out with recommendations entirely independent of what the council had been saying, because ultimately it's going to be the council staff that are going to be implementing these measures, and so they really need to understand and believe in those recommendations themselves, or otherwise they'll never get done. So this scenario planning, I'll just go into a little bit of detail about what we did here and why we did it. So with Phil Hart, who used to work for Shell Oil in the UK for a long time, he put forward a short-term supply disruption scenario. So a little bit like the gas crisis that happened in 1998 in Victoria, we were saying, let's think about the possibility of a short-term supply disruption where there's an explosion at an oil refinery in Victoria, and it knocks out 75% of our oil supply for a period between 2 and 6 weeks. And so the council then have a situation where they need to do all the most important things that they do, but with much less oil than they would ordinarily consume. So this is the oil terminal. There's an explosion. They're left with 25%. So what do they do? How do they decide what they're going to continue doing and what things they're going to put off for a period of between 2 and 6 weeks? And so it's also important to recognise that it wouldn't just be happening within the local council, this crisis, it would be a city-wide thing as well. So they're going to be operating in a very different environment than they're used to. The scenario 2 that we gave them was a steady decline. So this is a fairly typical peak oil situation where you've got a reduction of 3% annually in terms of oil supply, and that means that you've got 40% less by 2025. And so the challenge there is really about continually implementing innovations that reduce your oil consumption, because you can't just do one hit like, for instance, the council had recently established a policy of only purchasing 4-cylinder vehicles for their fleet, and that had a dramatic impact on their oil consumption for that year and for the year after. But after that, it doesn't provide you with the annual reductions in oil consumption. So you've got to keep on doing things. And so is it business as usual or planning for resilience? And so the feeling in the room at the workshop with the council staff was that this is something of planning for resilience, of continuing to have to work towards oil efficiencies and changes in the way that they do things in order to continually minimise the reliance that they have on oil. So these were the 10 representative service areas that we came up with council. And it's important to emphasise that this did happen in very close coordination with the council staff themselves. And so there are some pretty usual suspects there, I would say. Waste management with heavy vehicles going on every street in the municipality every single week. You can see how they would be at the top of the list on in terms of what you need to focus on in terms of reducing oil consumption. Transport and road maintenance, clearly both in terms of the inputs for road materials, but also in terms of just how much transport and what sort of transport might be going about, especially in a long-term oil supply decline. And then you can, I won't go through all the individual items on the list there, but you can see some obvious ones as well, such as fleet management and also staff travel to work is a key thing. And that would be key to any local council, not just Maribyrnong. The only other two I'll explain there on this list are right down the bottom, so transport and food security. And the reason we've got them in there is because obviously oil is a key input for both those areas, but, and this is a tough distinction to explain, but the council wanted to separate out oil contingency planning for the business of council, for what they do as an organisation, versus the community impacts of oil depletion and oil vulnerability. And so whilst those two items down the bottom there are in the plan, they're considered to be more community impacts and not so much council core businesses as organisational management impacts. So there's a distinction there which I think is important to explain. We also did an audit of their fuel use as an organisation, and you can see there that some areas on the key service areas that we identified use more oil than others. Waste management, that's artificially low there because they don't include the contractor oil consumption. So like many municipalities, they contract their waste management services out, and the contractor wasn't willing to cooperate with us to give us the figures for how much oil that they consume. So I can only assume that it's a lot of money. We did a projection in-house that it would be about 3 million litres a year. So whatever it happens to be, clearly waste management is an area that consumes a lot of oil, regardless of whether you're talking about Maribyrnong or any other local council.
So why was IT so high? Information technology?
Well, it's a good question. I think we included some of the costs of travel between the staff, between the council offices that were IT based in terms of deliveries, and it could have also been deliveries within Melbourne, so from where the IT consumables were purchased to the offices. But to be honest, I'm not sure if that explains the magnitude that you can see in the graph there. So I mentioned earlier that we did some risk profiles of the different service areas that we had identified, and so this risk management process, which was using a fairly conventional risk management framework where you rate the different areas between 1 to 5, 5 being extremely high risk and 1 being low risk. You can see there that a lot of them are coming up very high, either very high or extreme, in fact. And so this is something that Council's risk management team were very concerned about, because it's not actually that often that you get a 5. And so Meals on Wheels, the reason that came up as being very high is because all of the food, both in terms of the production of food to get to the kitchen and then from the kitchen to the houses, is all based on oil-fueled transport. And so given that, plus the consequence rating of how dependent that subsector of the community is to those food deliveries, that then naturally becomes an extremely high-risk area. So waste management as well, in terms of the environmental health consequences of having a disruption in the collection of waste for between 2 and 6 weeks. So keep in mind, this is just for the scenario 1 possibility, that short-term oil supply disruption. One thing that may seem peculiar to here is, I think down the bottom you can see infrastructure and road maintenance. It's only coming up as a 2. Now the reason for that is because the road maintenance and infrastructure staff felt that for a period of between 2 and 6 weeks, they could probably forego some of the things that they would ordinarily do and then just do them once conditions have returned to normal. So if you keep an eye on that category, when we look at the scenario 2 situation, you'll see that they move up in terms of their risk profile. And so Meals on Wheels, and this does vary between states. I was doing some talks in New South Wales, and I got a few strange looks whenever I mentioned Meals on Wheels, and it turns out that people in local government in New South Wales don't have to provide Meals on Wheels. I'm not quite sure what the state of play is in Tasmania, but nevertheless, it's very clear, and I think it's a good illustration of some of the potential impacts of peak oil, because it's probably not the first thing that you think of. And yet it has quite a profound impact on some of our most vulnerable members of the community. Okay, so for scenario 2, which is that long-term steady decline at 3% annually, year on year, you can see that, as I mentioned earlier, infrastructure and road maintenance have moved up in terms of the risk profile, because there's only so long that you can put off these road maintenance tasks. Although, as someone mentioned in a talk that I was doing at the university yesterday, the challenge for infrastructure and road maintenance may be very different in a long-term decline situation than we're used to, in terms of the sorts of vehicles and the volumes of vehicles that might be on our roads, and therefore the wear and tear as a consequence. I'm happy to take a question now if you want.
Why is the food security so low?
Yeah, food security is low in this one because this plan looked very much at the business continuity of the council itself, so how well the council could maintain the things that they needed to do. In the following financial year, their plan was to commission a community peak oil contingency plan, which would have transport and food security as front and centre risk areas. So that's why it's low here, but they do recognise that food security isn't a small issue. It's just that for the purposes of council business, it's not that big. It's more of a community impact. I can talk to you more about that later. Our consultancy team took about 3 weeks to understand this concept really well, so it's not surprising that other people find it difficult as well, because we certainly did. So the plan was able to highlight threats posed by both a short-term severe cut in fuel supply as well as a longer-term reduction in oil output. And in terms of our risk profiling and seeing where the risks lie in terms of either a short or a long-term supply disruption, with the ratings that we found for both scenarios, it translated into, according to their risk management framework, a considerable level of human and financial resources should be applied to reduce these risks. So it was highlighted by Council, and the report was endorsed by Council as something that really deserves a lot more attention than it had previously been given. And the Council were also very interested in finding out from us what they could do in a monitoring sense to better understand when they're going to need to implement some of the actions that have come out of this report. And so we suggested that looking at the local oil supply chain to see whether there are any consolidations in terms of refineries was something that they could look at, because if you have 4 refineries and that goes down to 1 or 2 refineries, then any emergency that occurs at those refineries obviously makes a much larger impact in terms of the state's oil supply. Community anger at high fuel prices is also something that they should probably monitor, which is partly because it's easy to monitor it, and I think it's important to give people things that are front and centre, that you don't have to spend days and days with Excel spreadsheets to work out whether it's something they should be concerned about or not. So it's very easy to monitor, and it gives a good indication of what sort of pressure is being applied to the community in terms of higher fuel prices as well. And reduced global spare capacity as well. That's something that is easily able to be monitored through the International Energy Agency website. So some of the emerging themes that came out of this process was staff travel to work was a huge one in terms of the proportion of staff that travel in single occupant motor vehicles on a daily basis to work, and what might happen in terms of a high fuel price, whether in a short-term situation or a long-term decline. Staff travel was something that was going to impact on business continuity. The community mobility and access, whilst considered more of a community problem than a business continuity problem, if I can try and make that distinction again, and the same is also true for food security in terms of the availability of food and the price of food under particularly a long-term peak oil situation, although of course in a short-term disruption, panic buying could easily strip food availability from the supermarket shelves in a short amount of time, and we used some international examples, particularly from the UK, where that had happened. Storage and inventory was an issue we felt for business continuity. There was no on-site storage of fuel supplies, so even though we were made the point of saying that having an on-site storage of diesel or unleaded isn't a good solution in a long-term sense, from a short-term perspective, having 20,000 litres of fuel so that you can then ration that out amongst your vehicles to do essential council work over a short-term supply disruption could be something that would prove useful. The council and us as consultants felt that it was very important to come up with a peak oil plan that was very consistent with the council's views on climate change as well, and not move to sources of energy that were going to exacerbate problems with climate change, but something that would work in synergy with the council's actions in that area as well. New technology seemed to be something that had real possibilities in terms of being able to reduce the vulnerability of council as a business. Now, whether that be in terms of vehicle technology, and the council has gone on to purchase some energy efficient trucks and also some electric vehicles, but also in terms of the use of the internet for doing council business, paying rates, that sort of thing. Also community forums that could be done as webinars online, and also staff travel to work could be minimised to some extent by having people work from home for some of the week. 1 or 2 days a week for most council staff seem to be manageable, although of course try telling that to a groundskeeper and obviously that's not going to work. So there are some parts of council that will be able to do that and some parts that just won't. Looking at service delivery model changes was also interesting. So we looked at things like Meals on Wheels and wondering whether we could actually flip on its head the way that is done, so that it can be a neighbourhood responsibility and localised. We have community leaders being responsible partly for the production of food, but also for the delivery of food within a very tight neighbourhood area, and that then lends itself to a delivery model that can be pedal powered rather than petrol powered, and that's something that I think is going to be increasingly important, especially given the high risk rating that Meals on Wheels received. But that's just one example of, I think, an entirely new way of thinking in terms of minimising the vulnerability from higher fuel prices. And then finally, communication and letting the council, as a council, letting the community know that this is what they're doing to try and improve council's own performance on fuel consumption, and then providing some tools to the local community so that they can start doing things to minimise their own consumption of oil. So I've mentioned staff travel to work, and I think this picture really illustrates the fact that, and this would be true in Tasmania as well, between 85 and 90% of all the staff get to work by private motor vehicle, and you can imagine what a vulnerability that really is in terms of a situation where you've got much less oil, or you've got oil but at much higher prices than you're used to. So one of the recommendations that we put forward, which is currently in the process of being implemented in council, is to trial a scenario one response before it actually happens. So this is a little bit like conducting a fire drill and making sure that your processes are in place to be able to evacuate a building efficiently in the event of a real fire. Well, this is the same sort of thing. So for a week or even for a day, you can trial what it would be like to use only 25% of the oil that you would ordinarily use. And that means that when it comes to the real thing, you're going to be much better prepared to do it. So in summary, peak oil is an imminent threat to business continuity, and that's something that's true for councils and other organisations, whether it's universities, large businesses, state government. Councils that move ahead of the oil depletion curve will be more resilient, and assessing the threats and exploring responses is essential, and doing that before it actually becomes a crunch point. And embedding oil efficiency measures within council practice is essential, and so not having a document that stands on its own, yes, we've got our peak oil document, we don't need to do anything anymore, it's sitting up there on the shelf, really moving away from that as a response and trying to embed the thinking that went into this peak oil contingency plan into all the other aspects of council business and into the other strategies, so that it isn't just an isolated policy that sits on its own, but it's something that's very much integrated into the way that councils do business, whether it's the groundskeeping policy or the HR policy, whatever it happens to be. Having peak oil as a thing that people need to respond to, regardless of your area of council, is really important. And so that's it. So I'm happy to take some questions if we've got time, which I hope we do.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Elliot. 2 hands up.
You mentioned the issue of community anger over fuel prices. We have detected a different level of anger as well. People feeling that the issue is not, government's not being open with them about it. And I'm wondering whether the exercise that you've done with the local government has helped your relationship with community to the extent that they feel more confident that that level of government at least is being open and frank with them.
Yeah, look, I think, there are really 2 issues in broad terms. Is the anger that they're having to fill up their car with fuel and it's costing them more than they think it should be costing them, and then the criticism that many people have, but I'm sure it's more prevalent in this room than it is in the wider community, and that is that this is an issue but councils aren't doing anything about it. And I think this process was beneficial to the Maribyrnong community because they could see that this is something that council's actually working on, but it did, I think, highlight as well to the community that this is something where state and federal responsibilities are really significant but are entirely lacking in terms of action. And so I think it gives council a tick of approval in that they're starting to tackle this problem, but it also really highlights the paucity of action in state and federal government.
Sharon?
There's a huge amount of emphasis on transport in this forum, and I'm just starting to wonder if we're going to start talking about all the other places where oil is present. So in the plastics that surround our food, in the chairs that we sit on, in the IT industry, fertiliser, pharmaceuticals, it just goes on and on and on. And I'm just wondering what other stuff other than transport, and you may not be the right person to ask as you're the director of the institute. But is there other bigger picture stuff that's starting to look at on a local level or even state or federal level?
Well, I can answer part of that, but perhaps there'll be other people that can answer the question more fully. So you're right, this report was very focused on transport. The community plan, which will be financed in the coming financial year, I think, will be more focused on naturally the community impacts. And whilst transport still is a component of that, there are huge consumption impacts that aren't so much related to transport, but in the areas that you mentioned in terms of plastics, fertilisers, food security, those sorts of things. So that will come out. But I think it is a fair criticism that peak oil has been so focused on transport. There are some hugely significant other issues that aren't being concentrated on. I think 65 or 70% of the world's oil is used for transport, but then you've still got, 30% is still significant, and that's being used for non-transport purposes. So it will be interesting to see what council chooses to do, not just Maribyrnong Council, but other councils in terms of non-transport-based impacts of peak oil. But I'm not sure whether Peak Oil Tasmania has an answer to that or...
No. And it would take up time people asking you questions too, I think. Michael and then John.
There was an example in Victoria back in the 70s when the Transport Workers Union went on strike and the supermarkets there emptied within 2 days. But one thing on your waste, is there any way the councils could control the constituents of waste? In other words, we have recycling, we have some separation at the moment. Could that be, did you consider that as one way of minimising problems with waste?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think fundamental to this question of what waste collection is how much consumption there is in the community, because the more consumption there is, the more waste there is. And the more waste there is, then the harder the job of collecting it becomes. We looked at some possibilities in terms of fortnightly collections instead of weekly collections for recyclables, which doesn't have the same sort of environmental health issues that non-recyclable waste has. Also the possibility of moving wheelie bins to the end of the street so that a council collection vehicle can just go up the street without having to go down each one individually, although there are going to be some issues there in terms of communities' feeling on that and the perception that council's just trying to make it easier for themselves rather than doing something that's really focusing on peak oil. But also the possibility of providing for free or at heavily subsidised rates compost and worm farm facilities for the community so that you can minimise the waste there as well. So there were some of the things that we looked at on the waste front to try and minimise the transport task associated with it.
John.
Elliot, on your last slide you had councils keeping ahead of the oil depletion curve. Did you look at other scenarios like crash, full of steps or jagged thingamies? Well,
it's a curve, but a curve, I guess, is a simplistic way of looking at it. It's probably not a curve. There could be all sorts of ways of describing whatever that line is on in terms of oil supply. The council's feeling, and this came up even before we arrived, was that in terms of a crash, they're not going to look at that because if there is, they're not quite sure what role there's going to be for local council anyway. In terms of a really severe, doomsday scenario. So that they thought they might as well concentrate on something that is manageable, where council does have a role, focus on that rather than focusing on the worst case scenario, in which case they're not quite sure what might happen anyway.
Just a very quick comment on that one. I've been in touch with a very smart lady who was an actuary. Mm-hmm. And for Christmas she sent me a message and said she thinks that peak oil will be the end of electricity.
I'll take that more as a comment than a question.
And one last question, Bill.
What was the conversation like with regard to switching from oil to gas and electric vehicles, gas-powered electric vehicles?
Yep.
And also in light of the gas breaking disaster that's going on at the moment, that we're seeing on the mainland and other countries as well.
Yep.
So was that part of the conversation?
Yeah, it was. Phil Hart, our energy planner, took the largest role in terms of that. I mainly look at demand side rather than supply side solutions, but council has purchased a couple of electric vehicles. They've also got a few electric bikes, and so a shift towards electric vehicles for the tasks that do require a motorised vehicle to complete is where they're going with that. We didn't focus much on gas, so I'm probably not going to be able to add much to your knowledge on gas and what Maribyrnong's view on it is.
Thank you very much, Elliot.
Okay, thanks.